Hey everybody. Um, I'm interested. Today I'm reading Vladimir Petrovich Shkredov. Uh, his I'm not reading by anything by him. I'm reading a biography of him that is featured on the historical materialism website, historicalmaterialism.org. Um, this piece is by a Alexander Y. Chepurenko, who seems to be a Russian academic in the social sciences with some interest in the political economic or the economic theories of Karl Marx. So, um, the reason I'm reading this is because Shkredov has been mentioned in a couple of pieces, but the main piece that I remember him being mentioned in was he's mentioned in a couple of articles by Paresh Chattopadhyay, and he talks about how Shkredov, I think he references Shkredov in relation to the nature of competition between producing economic units in the Soviet Union. And that would be like a big part of determining whether or not the USSR could be called state capitalist or bureaucratic capitalist or something of that nature. If you could, in some way, demonstrate that there was an operative market between an operative market in some sense in the Soviet Union, and competition between firms would have been a large component of that. And I think he uses Shkredov as like an example of an economist within the Soviet Union who did think that there was competition inside it. I have no idea if this piece is going to mention anything related to the question of the mode of production or non-mode of production in the Soviet Union, but that's what has initiated my interest in the piece. So here we go. Biography. Vladimir Shkredov was born in a small town in the Saratov region. At the start of World War II, the family relocated to Frunze, now Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyz Republic. In 1943 to 44, VP Shkredov was a battery commander as part of the Wojsko Polski. He was decommissioned after receiving a serious wound and was later awarded the Polish, quote, Silver Cross for his military merits. After the war, Shkredov studied at the All-Union Correspondence Institute of Law while working as a tax inspector in rural areas of the Kyrgyz Republic. Shkredov was responsible for collecting land and other related taxes. This experience led to his interest in the role of legal norms and property forms in economic processes. In 1951, Shkredov began his academic career at Kyrgyz State University. In 1960, Shkredov was invited to change to Moscow Lomonosov University, where Shkredov taught political economy at the Department of Economics until 1978. Shkredov worked his way up from an assistant professor to a full professor. In 1978, Shkredov was forced to leave the Lomonosov University and to move over to the Academy of National Economy, later renamed the Russian Academy of National Economy and State Service, where Shkredov worked until his death in 1996. New section, Main Works and Ideas. Having started with the study of law in the 1950s, Shkredov was also involved in investigating the nature of economic processes in the Soviet Union. Shkredov's focus is on the relationship of economics and law. In the USSR, this sort of approach had to be based on Marx's Capital and his investigation of the dialectics of the relations of production in its juridical forms, objectified and property rights. In 1968, Shkredov wrote his habilitation thesis called the principle of approaching the relations of production from the point of view of their juridical form of expression. The ideas of this thesis were previously presented in a series of publications, particularly the monograph Socialist Land Property, published in 1967, where Shkredov defended the realist view of land property's role in the formation of prices of agricultural production under socialism and insisted on the objective existence of the differential land rent which must be accepted in the process of planning in order to avoid shortages and price distortions. While stressing the relative independence of the realm of law, Shkredov, like Marx, argued that the creative role of law in an economy is always restricted by the level of productive forces. The dialectics of the economic relations and their legal form was explored in another monograph called Economy and Law, published in 1967. In these texts, Shkredov not only laid the foundation of the Marxist institutionalism in the Soviet economic literature, but also delivered a critique of the Stalinist version of political economy, which dominated Soviet economics from the 1930s to the 1960s. This assumed of the leading role of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the socialist system. This assumed the leading role of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the socialist system of economic relations. The last example of this approach was found in the textbook on political economy designed for universities and edited by Konstantin Ostrovityanov et al. In 1954. According to Wikipedia, Konstantin Ostrovityanov lived from 1892 to 1969 and was a Soviet Marxist economist, academic, and public figure. Back to the text. Already at that time, Shkredov identified a fundamental distortion of Marx's ideas regarding the dialectics of the economy and the historical character of its forms in the Soviet literature on political economy and the Soviet philosophical theory of cognition. At the end of the 1960s, Shkredov began to study Marx's writings in philosophical literature on Marx's method of investigation and systematic exposition of his theory. As a result, Shkredov became an expert on Hegel's logic. In some respects, Shkredov's view of the similarities and differences between Marx's logic of capital and Hegel's logic, the book, Science of Logic, was similar to the conception developed by the Soviet philosopher Viktor Vasyulin in his The Logic of Marx's Capital, published in 1968, and was close to Isaac Illich Rubin's interpretation of Marx's method in Capital and the role of value form analysis. Wikipedia says Viktor Vasyulin, Jesus Christ, how do you say it? Viktor Vasyulin lived from 1932 to 2012 and was a Soviet and Russian philosopher. Viktor Vasyulin became famous for his deep knowledge of Karl Marx's work, as well as for further developing Marxism through the dialectical sublation of its acquis, A-C-Q-U-I-S, clarification needed, according to Wikipedia. Doctor of Sciences in Philosophical Sciences, 1973. He lived from 1932 to 2012. And I'll read this little summary of his work here. V.A. Vasyulin wrote a novel, Distinct Direction, in social theory, dialectical logic, and science methodology. The main scientific achievements of V.A. Vasyulin include 1. Reveal the logic of Karl Marx's Capital Critique of Political Economy theory by a systematic, categorical, comparative evaluation of capital's political economic material alongside a parallel critical analysis of Hegel's The Science of Logic. The comparative cross-examination enabled Vasiulin to explore the methodology of the advanced scientific research of the mature science as an organic whole. Within the framework of this logic and methodology are revealed, in, quote, pure form, end quote, the ascent from the abstract to the concrete in its dialectical unity, with the ascent from the sensual concrete to the abstract too, the logical in its unity with the historical, and 3, the reasonable aspect of thinking, German Vernunft, in unity with the intellectual. 2. A concrete historical approach of Marxism as a scientific system that is developed through the emergence and resolution of necessary contradictions. For Vasiulin, Marxism is a scientific system that consists of internally united, in their differences, components, each of which is at a certain level of its formation and development. This logical and methodological analysis of the history of Marxism paved the way for 1. The discovery of the objective laws and contradictions, including the necessary fallacies of the beginning, the emergence, the formation, and the maturity of the development of scientific research, i.e. the movement of cognitive thinking from the surface to the essence of the object of the subject matter, and 2. The development of the most promising components of Marxism. 3. Revealed the inner systematic interconnection of laws and categories of social theory, which reflect the structure of the mature society and outline the theoretical periodization of human history, the objective laws of its, quote, ascent from the beginning, the emergence, the formation, to the maturity, from the perspective of the interactions of natural and social factors. The first 2 achievements are internally connected to the approach of scientific thinking as a natural historical process. So that is so much for Victor Vasiulin. Back to the text. I'm going to assume you know something about Isaac Illich Rubin. I have a number of pieces about or related to Isaac Illich Rubin on this channel. In his next and most well-known book, The Method of Investigation of Property in Marx's Capital, published in 1973, V.P. Shkredov expanded on this theme. Here, V.P. Shkredov demonstrated that private property appears in Marx's theoretical system first as an actual precondition of the capitalist mode of production, and then as a result of dialectical transformation as the capitalist mode of production's final outcome. Moreover, Shkredov criticized the dominant Soviet notion, based on Engels and Lenin's understanding of capital, of the coincidence of the logical order of appearance of certain categories in capital, and the historical order of the development of the, quote, simple production of commodities, end quote, into the, quote, capitalist production of commodities, end quote. So already here, I don't know if he talks about it, and maybe it'll be referenced later on in this section, but it seems like there's important, actually, never mind, fuck. In terms of like the so-called homology, thesis, like the correspondence of Marx's logic of capital to Hegel's logic is something that is important to Chris Arthur, and so is, and it so happens, and this is not a position unique to Chris Arthur, the position that the critique of the historico-logical conception of the first chapters of Capital or like the idea that the early chapters of Capital are some kind of like historical gloss on the history of capitalism, and the development of capitalism. Um, that critique is very prominent, and especially the concept of simple commodity production. There's a paper by Chris Arthur on this channel titled "The Myth of Simple Commodity Production," and the myth not being that whether or not simple commodity production was ever a real generalized mode of production. That's not what he means by myth. What he means by myth is the myth that is what Marx is writing about in, say, chapter 1 of Capital, right? So once upon a time, there was, it looks something kind of like to the effect of like, once upon a time, there was simple commodity circulation, and then there was capital, and then there was absolute surplus value, then relative surplus value, and then there was accumulation, or something like that, like on like the grander scale of the book. But particularly in those early chapters, it's about like, the historical logic would say that like the analyzing the value form, right? It was be like it was like a rough historical overview without like the distortions of actual empirical reality, the without distracting details of empirical reality, how money came into existence, basically. That would be like the historical logical method. And other people are saying, no, what is trying to be demonstrated there, it's kind of a logical argument for the necessity of value appearing as exchange value and hence as money. So there's kind of like what is being developed in Capital is an increasingly richer, dynamic picture of the necessary features of a capitalist mode of production, basically. It's a systematic exposition as opposed to a historical exposition, if that makes sense. So there's this. It seems like VP Shkredov is part, at least from what I'm reading here, is part of this larger like re-examination of like very fundamental assumptions about the nature of Marx's critique of political economy and what Capital is setting out to achieve. Anyway, let me repeat that last sentence because I kind of talked a lot. Moreover, Shkredov criticized the dominant Soviet notion, based on Hegel's and Lenin's understanding of capital, of the coincidence of the logical order of appearance of certain categories in capital, and the historical order of the development of the, quote, simple production of commodities, end quote, into the, quote, capitalist production of commodities, end quote. Since this Soviet Marxist theory was based on some ambiguous passages of the standard editions of Capital, especially on the version of the value form in the first chapter in the second edition and later editions, Shkredov published the article The Study of the Value Form in the First Edition of Marx's Capital, published in 1976, where VP Shkredov showed, before Hans-Georg Backhaus's paper of 1978 and Gerhard Güller's book in 1980, that between the first and the following editions of the first volume of Capital, Marx revised the initial strictly dialectical flow of arguments and added some confusing examples and formulations in order to provide a, quote, more popular, end quote, exposition of his theory of value. The notion of, quote, simple value production, end quote, as the subject matter of the first chapter of the first volume of Capital, and the notion of a, quote, unity of the historical and the logical, end quote, in Marx's work were, at the time, based on Engels and Lenin's canonical interpretation of Marx's method of the economic analysis. Additionally, the notion of simple value production and unity of the historical and the logical were core principles of the large textbook on political economy prepared by a group of authors from Lomonosov University under the editorship of Professor Nikolay Zagalov. and 3 editions were published: 1960, 1970, and 1973 to 74. And I'm not seeing anything for Nikolai Zagalov on the internet. Shkredov initially belonged to the core group of contributors. VP Shkredov's critique of simplified reception of the logic and content of capital was inevitably met with strong objections from the dogmatic majority of leading Soviet economists and philosophers. VP Shkredov's views were discussed during a, quote, seminar on methodology, end quote, held by the chair of political economy in 1975 to 76. During this discussion, Shkredov and a few of his supporters were accused of, quote, Rubin-style revisionism, end quote, and, quote, anti-Marxism, end quote. Nevertheless, even after VP Shkredov was pushed out of the university and became a professor at the Academy of National Economy, Shkredov made some new contributions to the discussion on Marx's theoretical method. In the 1980s, VP Shkredov collaborated with the group of scholars in the Marx and Engels section of the Institute of Marxism-Leninism. Among those scholars were some of his former students who launched a seminar on open questions regarding Marx's economic legacy and shaped a series of monographs dedicated to different stages of Marx's work on capital, published in 1983 and 1987. Here, especially in his 2 chapters in the monograph on the Grundrisse, published in 1987, VP Shkredov explored the role of Marx's early economic writings, and specifically the Grundrisse, in the formation of the theoretical system of capital. Shkredov widened his understanding of capital and introduced the notions of, quote, dialectical political economy, end quote, and Marx's, quote, concrete historicism, end quote. According to Shkredov, Marx's analysis concerned the already mature capitalist mode of production, i.e. the system that itself shaped the conditions of disclosure of its internal moments and thus also enabled the understanding of the specific premises of its developed form, but not vice versa. Moreover, Marx's dialectical investigation of the capitalist economy became possible only because during his time, the capitalist mode of production already subsumed and transformed the existing mode of production in accordance with the immanent logic of the surplus value production. The logic of capital reflected the internal logic of the mature capitalist mode of production, starting with the abstract forms, commodity money, and developing into an investigation of more concrete and more specific forms. The descriptions of the abstract forms, such as the commodity and money, are not very detailed. Therefore, it might look as if Marx starts with the historically oldest primitive forms of economic relations. But the commodity and money came into their own and became properties of capital only within the capitalist economic system. Shkredov called this sort of theoretical approach to a developing social system, perceived from an objective point of view, quote, concrete historicism, end quote. Moreover, Shkredov stressed that, before the capitalist mode of production came to its mature form, neither Ricardo nor the Ricardians were able to present a complex and homogeneous vision of the economy and the economy's totality. Therefore, the, quote, political economy of the socialist mode of production, end quote, could be developed when, only when, and if this mode of production were to mature, i.e. on the basis of a corresponding type of productive forces. At that time, as Shkredov was becoming more and more a, quote, Marxologist, end quote, Shkredov became acquainted with the works of some other nonconformist Soviet and East German scholars who investigated the history of Marx's economic theory. Georgy Bagaturia and Vitaly Vygotsky delivered the most comprehensive study of Marx's economic theory and argued that, quote, mature Marxist economic theory began only after the Grundrisse, where Marx first clearly distinguished between labor and labor power, and thus shaped the fundamentals of the surplus value theory. Others were Albert Kogan, who wrote on the so-called six-book plan by Marx, which was never abandoned by him, where capital forms only the first part of the first book, and Igor Boldyrev, who wrote about the theoretical role of the expression of, quote, capital in its totality, end quote. I don't really see anything for Georgy Bagatoria. Let's see. Vitaly Vygotsky, I know. Vitaly Vygotsky actually has pieces on the Marxist.org website. I don't know what pieces he has available, but damn, I can't find anything on Vitaly Vygotsky. I'm surprised because he's kind of like a big deal. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything. So, anyway, carrying on. Others were Albert Kogan, who wrote on the so-called six-book plan by Marx, which was never abandoned by him, where capital forms only the first part of the first book, and Igor Boldyrev, who wrote about the theoretical role of the expression, quote, capital in its totality, end quote. I already read that, didn't I? Yeah, they're not seeing anything. Back to the text. Shkredov and his ideas were either ignored or implicitly criticized in mainstream economic theory in the late USSR as a form of non-conventional thinking contrasted with scholastic exercises of the Soviet scholars of economics. As the systemic changes in the former USSR, and especially in Russia, were implemented in accordance with the SLIP model, stabilization, liberalization, institutional building, privatization of state-owned enterprises by the World Bank and other international financial institutions, Shkredov analyzed the strategy of economic transition and criticized the model of a quick voucher privatization in Russia in his last monograph, Money, Entrepreneurship, State, published posthumously in 1999 by his former students. There, Shkredov argued that a quick change of established rules and property rights would hardly be adequately supported by the beliefs, norms, and economic behavior of the majority of the population. Hence, it would lead not to the emergence of a large number of efficient proprietors, but to a redistribution of the national wealth among a few interest groups. Shkredov called for a combination of the state and the private sector for a certain period of time until the legal environment and the general norms became more entrepreneurship friendly. New section: Contributions to the scholarship of his time. In the 1970s, Shkredov revived the discussion on Marx's economic theory and its methodology that had previously taken place in the 20s and 30s. But unlike Isaac Ilyich Rubin, Shkredov focused not purely on the reception of Marx, but on the possibility of applying Marxian methodology to the understanding of the real contemporary economy, law, and society. Shkredov's legacy is, in many respects, close to the ideas of the critical reconstruction of Marx's Capital in the Western neo-Marxist literature of the 1960s and 70s, particularly to the ideas of some West German projects and groups of that time. However, in some senses, Shkredov's work is innovative, since Shkredov developed his notion of the reception of Marx's economic theory and its methodology before Western neo-Marxists, and did so while surrounded by the followers of the dogmatic Marxist-Leninist take on Marx's economic theory. Unlike some neo-Marxists, Shkredov never tried to reduce Marx's method to Hegel's logic and Marx's labor theory of value to Ricardian or Sraffian ideas. Moreover, in a new socioeconomic circumstances of the 1990s, Shkredov demonstrated the advantages of Marx's approach to an institutional approach to the relationship between economy and other realms of society. V.P. Shkredov was a beloved teacher of many generations of students during his time at Moscow State Lomonosov University. Some of his students became well-known scientists, entrepreneurs, and managers. Even 2 decades after his death, seminars on V.P. Shkredov's ideas were organized at the Lomonosov University, and some of his public speeches were published by his followers. One of his most known former students is Dr. Alexander A. Kandruev, who worked on the application of the Marxian theory of money to the conditions of the late 20th century, published in 1983, and who was, from 1992 to 1998, a deputy chairman and later first deputy chairman of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Another known former student is Dr. Rolf Hecker, who is one of the co-editors of the Mega and an internationally recognized historian of Marxian economic thought. I don't know if anything by Rolf Hecker is published in English, but he is very important. I think he's I think he's pretty often thanked, like in the what's it called? He's pretty often thanked in the acknowledgement sections of a lot of books, especially coming from the German world. So that's the end of the little intro to Shkredov. I'll read the list of his publications. His first publication is Economy and Law on the Principles of the Investigation of Production Relations in Connection with the Legal Form of Their Expression. Socialist Land Property, published in 1967. The Method of Investigation of Property in Marx's Capital, published in 1973. Money Entrepreneurship State, published in 1999. His selected book chapters and papers include 1975, Commodity and Commodity Circulation as the Premises of the Analysis of the Process of Production of Capital. 1976, Investigation of the Value Form in the First Edition of Karl Marx's Capital. 1983, The Analysis of the Value Form in the First Volume of Capital. 1988, The Results of Marx's Economic Studies in the 1980s, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, first part. The Transformation of Political Economy into a Dialectical Science. And 1985, On the System of Argumentation in Capital.